Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some Floral Hello Friend cards using the You've Got a Friend collection from Hero Arts. This is the abstract floral stamp and cut set, some beautiful large florals with unique designs. Then we have the bitty floral stencil set. This is a layering stencil to color in the florals. And then we also have a bitty floral die set that can be used on its own or with the bitty floral stencil. Then we have the Hello Friend die set, some great sentiments, nice and large, and it also coordinates with the Hello Friend stamp set. You could use either one separate or together as well. This last one here is called the Squiggly rectangle frames, perfect for adding just fun, unique frames to your cards. So I'm going to start off by stamping some of those abstract florals, and I'm going to use a combination of distress inks as well as interference inks for some unique look as well as a little bit of shimmer. Because I haven't used this stamp set yet, I'm using a white eraser on the stamping surface. This just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps that stamp take ink just a little bit better. Once I'm done doing that, I use a brush on the surface to remove any eraser bits. I'm going to be using some Hammermill cardstock here to stamp on. I'm just going to fill this quarter sheet with a bunch of the florals, and I'm going to stamp them in different color combinations. This way, once I'm ready to start creating my cards, I have a large variety and a bunch of different colors and color combinations to pick and choose from and just grab from. So now that I have my sheet filled, and when I filled it, I made sure to leave some space so that I can die cut these easily. I'm ready to close my door to my Misti, attach them to the door, and we're ready to start stamping. So I'm starting off with using some picked raspberry distress ink. I'm going to stamp multiple times in order to get a nice crisp, clean floral on there, or crisp, clean, solid image on there. Once I'm done with my distress ink, I'm just going to use a damp microfiber cloth, clean the surface, and now I'm using some Lavender Fields interference ink. Now, interference inks are like two color combinations in a pad at once. One color shows up on white or light cardstock, the other shows up on black or dark cardstock. This Lavender Fields shows up purple on white or light cardstock, but it shows up green on black or dark cardstock. And even though I'm doing it on top of distress ink, we're going to see that purple, but we're also going to see a little bit of that green shimmer. So it's going to give these florals a unique look. I put that color onto the stamp and then I just lightly misted it. The first one I did with my Mighty Mister. The next ones I'm going to do with my Distress Sprayer. I liked the way that spray affected the ink a little bit better. The second round of flowers, I used some Wilted Violet Distress ink, and now I'm using some Opal Blush Interference ink. So we're seeing blue on that stamp set. We're going to see a little bit of that blue mixed in with the purple for the florals, but the interference color is pink. So we're going to get a little bit of pink shimmer. Now, both the interference inks and distress inks are water reactive. So by spraying water on the stamp with the ink on there, it starts to bubble and bead onto that stamping surface. So we get a little bit of interesting texture on there. And it also affects the distress ink on our already stamped flowers. So I'm just creating some interesting texture so that it's not just completely flat and a little bit boring. For this next round of flowers, I have some spiced marmalade here, and I'm going to be using some pink champagne for the interference pad. So this pink champagne, we're seeing some beautiful pink. We're going to see a combination of that pink ink mixed with that spiced marmalade, but we're also going to see a little bit of that green shimmer on the areas where that water pools on our florals. And because we're stamping them, we don't have any control exactly where it's going to pool. So it just creates a really interesting and unique look. And our shimmer is going to be in different areas for each one of the florals. So we're not going to have a copy paste of all of the florals looking exactly the same, but just with different colors. They're going to have interference in different areas. Once I'm done with the florals, I went and did the same thing with some greens. So I'm using some Shabby shutters to stamp with the distress ink. Then I'm using Summer Garden interference. So the Summer Garden is green, but it has some blue interference. So where we get some extra water or extra shimmer, it's going to have a little bit of blue to it. So you could, if you wanted, use the interference pad on these stamps or with a blending brush to get it in certain areas. But I just thought this was an interesting way to get it a little bit different than what I normally do. Because I have a bunch of different florals when I did my floral stamping and a bunch of different greenery and stems here, I thought it'd be a little bit more interesting to use the interference inks on top of that whole stamp and then just mist with water to add a little bit of variety. And I really love the finish and the interesting look it creates. So I set those aside to completely dry. Because we use water, it's going to take a little bit longer to dry than normal. And I figured I would use the Bitty Floral stencil set to create a bunch of different backgrounds. I'm only going to do one on screen. The rest I do off screen, but I do them the same way as I do the one on screen. I just change up the colors a little bit. So for this one here, for the first layer, I started off with the Spiced Marmalade Distress ink. Then I'm going in with the Pink Champagne Interference ink, just adding a little bit of that pink color as well as that bit of shimmer. And I'm not being meticulous with this. I'm adding it on the sides of some flowers, the centers of some flowers, being heavier in some areas, lighter in other areas. I want just a variety of color. I want to see that orange mix with the pink and just have a little bit of a unique background with it. But I love the shimmer that we get with the interference inks. If we had larger florals, it would be easier to be a little bit more intentional with exactly where that ink went. But because these florals are fairly tiny, I just thought a little bit of a different background would be fun. So for the next layer here, I'm using the Picked Raspberry Distress ink. And you can see that some areas I'm heavier with the Picked Raspberry, in some areas I'm lighter. On the areas where I'm lighter, that's where I intend to put some of the Lavender Fields interference ink. So just like that first layer, I'm doing the second layer fairly similar. I'll have some flowers that will have some of both inks on it, some that will have just one or the other, but we're going to have just a different background. I'm doing 3 of these backgrounds total, and then I'll set them aside to dry, and you'll see why I need to let them dry in just a moment. And then some of those backgrounds are going to be used as is for background. Some are going to be die cut with the squiggly rectangle frames. And then I'm going to use one of them to die cut with the Bitty Floral die to create some confetti for a shaker card. This next layer here, I'm using the Shabby Shutters Distress ink. Then I will use the Summer Garden Interference ink with that to add a little bit of extra shimmer. So when I'm doing the leaves here, I'm trying to put some of that interference ink to the base of the leaf. So we have some leaves that start with the darker green with the shimmer to it, and then go out to that Shabby Shutters without any shimmer to it. So it makes that background really interesting. The last layer here has some detail for those leaves, but it also has some flower centers. So I'm just doing Summer Garden Interference ink here. It's going to add a nice layer to those leaves. It's going to combine with the colors of the flower to create a darker center to the florals. Once I have that interference ink on there, I'm going to take a damp microfiber cloth, clean that ink off, and then I'm using Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel, so that we have some stickles that has some glitter as well as dimension, just to give that background a little bit of sparkle. And this is why I need to let it dry once I'm done the background, because that stickles has some dimension to it, and it is going to need a little bit of time to dry before we start die cutting it. So I did use a palette knife for those stickles. When you're using it with ink, sometimes you lift up some ink from that stencil and it mixes in with the stickle. So you want to make sure that you don't put those stickles right back into the pot, especially if you've lifted up some ink with it. It won't be the same color as the rest of them. So I did just use as much as I thought I needed to complete that background. So off screen, I die cut all of those florals. I assembled some of them off screen, but here's one of each one of them on screen. They're super easy to layer together, and you can change up some of the layers. There's so many different options for the centers of the flowers that would be fun to mix and match them. I made my centers of my flowers, for the most part, a different color than the rest of the flower, just for a little bit of uniqueness. Once we have all those pieces assembled, I can set those aside to dry, and they'll be ready to pick and choose while I'm creating. I have the Hello Friend die set die cut as well, ready to assemble. I used white cardstock for the shadow for this version here, and black cardstock for the upper layer. I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to assemble them together. Having the glue in a fine line bottle makes it really easy to just use as much as you think you need. It works perfectly for assembling small die cuts like this, but it also works really, really well for assembling your cards. And I love using liquid glue because it gives you that wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. So once we did the friend, I'm going to do the hello as well. So for these cards, I'm doing some with the die, some with the stamp as well as the die, and then some with just the stamp for especially the sub-sentiments. So once I have these done, I can set these aside to dry, and I'll have them ready to pick and choose while I'm creating. I always love having a large variety of floral die cuts, sentiments, things to pick and choose while I'm creating, rather than stopping in the middle of it to create something that I didn't think to do ahead of time. It's always much easier to kind of have a bit of a smorgasbord of elements all around, so you can just kind of go with the creative flow. Sometimes I'll have a plan when I'm creating, or often I'll have a plan or a concept of a plan, but I will regularly in the middle of creating change my mind on exactly what I want to do or have a different idea. So it's nice to have a lot of different options to pick and choose from. For this first card, I used that squiggly rectangle frame, and I think this was the second largest one. I die cut it out of black cardstock, and I'm just going to use that Hello Friend die cut in the center of the card, and then I'm going to take some of those florals and put them around. I'm going to tuck them behind, and that's another great thing about using liquid glue as well. You can glue down some elements, but it takes a few moments for that to dry, so it makes it really easy to tuck things underneath and still have those elements there. It gives you a little bit of wiggle room when you're creating. Now for my sentiments for all of the cards, I just kept them black and white because I really love the pop of contrast that you get between black and white and colored florals. So the only color that I have in these cards are the florals that we stamped in die cut, as well as our floral backgrounds. The rest of the elements are black and white cardstock, so I really love the contrast to them. Now when I'm creating with florals and greenery, I typically will put my florals down first and then I'll tuck leaves in. This particular leaf had a stem to it and I didn't want the stem, so I just took my detailed scissors, cut it off, and I can tuck it right behind the flowers and it looks just like leaves. I could also have just cut those leaves off of the stem and just done the same thing with them. So you have a few options. You don't have to keep those flowers exactly how they were created. You can always snip and chop things off and customize them that way. So once I have my main florals on here, I can take some of those really tiny small florals and I can just fill them or use them to fill in areas where I think it just needs a little bit of filler. Another option here would be to use some leaves to do that as well, but I really love how the florals give it just a bit of a pop of color. You can see for this one, my main large florals were the pinks and purples. So for some of those ones to tuck in, I'll use some of the orange ones just to add a little bit of extra color. Now for a little bit of extra texture, I'm using some stickles on the flower centers. Now keep in mind, this is going to make the inks underneath it bleed because they are dye-based, water-based, water reactive. So I will only put it on the stamped dots of those centers. I don't put it on a large area because those inks will blend and bleed. I just put it right on top of that ink, put it there, and I'll let it aside or set it aside to dry. The stickles I use is a interference iridescent one, so you can see the color underneath there. It just adds a little bit of extra texture and a little bit of extra sparkle. For my next card, I want to use one of my stenciled backgrounds. Obviously, this isn't the one that I created on screen because the colors are different. The ones that I created off screen, I changed up the colors a little bit. I kept the same colors that I did the original abstract florals with. I just changed up the combinations a little bit for a little bit of interest. I used the squiggly rectangle frame dies. This is again the second largest one to die cut a frame. Then I am die cutting another one out of black cardstock. So we can use them on two different cards if we want. I end up just gluing the black one on top of the stenciled background one just for a little bit of extra dimension, but you don't necessarily need it because it's got some visual contrast anyways. So I'm going to glue these on top of an A2 card base. I'm going to start with my squiggly rectangle outline piece with the stenciled background, just so that I can make it a little bit, or it's a little bit easier to make it evenly spaced from the outer edges of the card. I'm doing all A2 cards for all of the cards. You could use larger ones if you want, and then use the largest of the squiggly rectangles. The squiggly rectangles, the largest one is about the size of an A2 card. I'll use it in one of my later cards just to have an outer frame on there, and you can see it or get a better idea of the size of it, but it is quite large. So I made sure for most of them to use the second size down so that we have a little bit of that card or the white card base behind it as well. So once I glued down that stencil background, both the squiggly rectangle as well as the inner piece and then the black piece, I wanted to create some sub-sentiments. So I have the Hello Friend stamp set. I'm going to use that white eraser on the stamping surface to remove any manufacturing residue and then brush those pieces off. Then I'm going to stamp a bunch of sentiments all at the same time. So I am going to stamp the hello and the friend. However, I'll tell you right now, this is not a good way to do it. I'll show you right after this a better way to do it. What I wasn't thinking here was the fact that that Hello Friend shadow die is a solid die. You can't see through it, so it makes it really hard to center the Hello Friend stamped sentiment. So I will do it. I'll redo these after this. Again, it wasn't until I had them completed and was going to die cut them that I realized that it was a solid die cut and it wasn't going to work the way that I was thinking in my head. If it was an open die and you could see the center of it, it would not have been an issue. Another option here would be to use detail scissors and fussy cut them, but because we already have a die, it doesn't make any sense to do that. Or to create kind of a sentiment strip with the solid hello. You could also use the hello and the friend on the backgrounds of your card or something else as well. You don't necessarily need to die cut it, but for the look that I was going for, I did want to die cut them. So I'm going to heat emboss these. I had a little bit of embossing powder tool that I put on my white cardstock. And then I'm stamping them with some Versamark ink, and I'll heat emboss them with some black embossing powder. So I like to emboss my sentiments for the most part because it gives you that extra little bit of texture. You get that raised shiny look from your sentiments. You don't necessarily need to. You could just use ink, and I'm using black here, but you could use a color if you wanted to add more color to it. Like I said before, I really love the look of colors with black or white, so that's why I kept the sentiments very simple with the black embossing powder. Another thing you could do is use black cardstock and white embossing powder. That would look fantastic as well. So once I've poured that embossing powder on there, I had a little bit of a hair coming out of one of them. It was a little fluffy, so I just used my tweezers to remove that. If you happen to have any embossing powder where you don't want it to go, you can use a brush to brush it off. You want to make sure to do that before you melt that into the paper, because once it's melted into the paper, it's there to stay. Once we have that done, I'm going to use a guillotine trimmer in order to trim those sub-sentiments. They're really easy to do. This is where I realized my mistake with the hello and the friend, because you can't see underneath that die. So like I said, I redo these and I'll show you a better way to do them where you can center that die cut. And basically it's by die cutting the die cut part first and then stamping on it, so you have a little bit more control and you get a little bit more perfect with it. But I do end up die cutting this because otherwise it was going to go to waste anyways, and show you how it got off center. Even though you try to center it and think you're doing it well, when you can't see it, it's impossible. So here it is. You can see it's completely off center. I won't be using these ones, but I wanted to die cut them and show you why it's not a good idea to do it this way. But again, because I had those sentiments done and ready to go, I figured I might as well finish them off. So here's that friend, and you can see it's completely off-centered. So the best way to do this is to die cut these pieces first, and I'm doing 2 of each one of them, so I will be die cutting them twice. I then am going to take those die cuts out of the die cut it a second time, and then we'll set those over to the side for just a moment. We're going to be using the negative part of the die cut in order to place our stamp, and we're going to use them with the Misti stamping tool in order to stamp it right and make sure that we get it centered. So I'm going to take those dies, we're going to die cut them a second time, repeat this exact same process, and then we will stamp and emboss. So I have my negative piece here in my Misti stamping tool. You could take those die cuts, insert them into the openings, and then position your stamp. But what I find a little bit easier is to have those die cuts out of there, put the stamp within that negative area. It just gives you a little bit of a better judgment of where that stamp is. Then stick it to the front of your Misti stamping tool or whatever your stamp positioner is. I'm going to do the same thing with the hello. Then once we have that done, I can insert those die cuts, then stamp them with the Versamark ink, then heat emboss those sentiments on there. When I stamp them with the Versamark ink and heat emboss, I'll just use some tweezers in order to hold those dies when I'm using that embossing tool, just because it can get a little bit hot. So I'm going to stamp them a couple times just to make sure we have a nice crisp, clean stamping. When you take those die cuts out, you want to make sure that we are not touching that ink and smearing it. It's a little bit, you have to be a little bit more gentle with the die cut, but you can see that we get a much better placing of that stamped sentiment when we do it this way. You have a lot more control. You can see exactly where that stamp is going to go, and you can make sure that you have it centered. And it's really easy to die cut a bunch of them and do a whole bunch of sentiments all at once. You could do a bunch of them all in black. You can do them in colors and then have them ready to go for future projects. So with that friend one done, we're going to do exactly the same thing with the hello and pour our embossing powder on there. If there happens to be any powder where we don't want it to go, we're going to take that off. Then we can use those tweezers to hold that sentiment and heat emboss the whole thing. So by doing it this way, you just get a more professional, a nicer look, a more finished look, because you have the control over exactly where that sentiment is. So once we have those done, and I did the other ones off screen, I'm going to use my guillotine trimmer to trim those sub-sentiments. Now, when I do that, you can see there's a clear guard on this trimmer. I use the right edge of that clear guard. I have my sentiment peeking out underneath there, and I make sure that that's nice and even. Then I turn it to the other side, do the same thing, but then I will check with the silver blade part on the base of my trimmer and make sure that it's nice and even on there before trimming the other side. I want to make sure that we have a nice even sub-sentiment and we don't have it thicker on one side and thinner on the other side. Then the last thing I do is do the two ends to that sentiment. So I did the rest of those sub-sentiments off screen. So for this card, because we have that floral background, I just added my friend sentiment as well as the sub-sentiment to it. I love the simple look to it, but because we have those florals in there, it's got a lot of color to it as well. For this next card, I'm going to be using the Bitty Floral die set, and I'm going to die cut those florals out. Now you could, if you wanted, do your stenciling after die cutting, just like I did with my stamp sentiment. This is a little bit easier to place and to position than the Hello Friend die set because there is the openings to the flowers so you can see them. If you look at my flowers really, really closely, there's a few that have a little bit of white to the side. I don't necessarily mind that, but you could, if you wanted after the fact, if it bothered you, take your ink blending brush and just add a little bit of ink to that to fill that in. So here we easily have a whole bunch of flower confetti. So I'm going to make a shadow box card with this. I have some window sheets from Pear Blossom Press that I'm going to be using for the front of my shadow box, or my shaker card, sorry. Now, this squiggly rectangle die only cuts the squiggly rectangle. It's not individual dies to create that. So there's not one that's going to work perfectly to go behind our squiggly frame for the front. So what I did was I measured the inner squiggle on the outer side of the frame, and I trimmed a piece of that window sheet to that size. I'm going to place it between two wiggly or squiggly frames and then set that aside to dry. Once I did that, I realized I had a little bit of that window sheet extending outwards. Once that glue has dried, I'm going to take some detailed scissors and I'm just going to trim that a little bit. I have 5 more frames that I'm going to layer up together for the frame of my shaker box. Now you could, if you wanted, use foam tape. However, because this is a squiggly frame, it makes it a little bit more challenging to put that tape there because it would take a lot more tape to squiggle it all the way around. The easiest way is to use a bunch of cardstock and die cut the die a bunch of times and layer them on top of each other. It's a lot more solid as well. You don't have to worry about openings in your foam tape either. Now, some of these squiggly rectangles, you might notice we have a little bit of a straight edge on some of them because my cardstock was a little bit narrow for it. But because these are underneath the top frame, it's not going to matter. We're not going to see that it's not a complete frame. We're going to see most of it. So we're just going to see black cardstock from the side, so that doesn't matter. So I set both of those aside to completely dry. I took my large squiggly rectangle and I die cut it out of some white cardstock in order to create an ink blended background. We're just going to use the inner piece to this, and I'm going to ink blend it with the Wilted Violet Distress ink. Then I'm going to go and do the Opal Blush Interference ink on top of that to create just a unique background. I wanted some color behind our floral confetti bits for the inside. I also wanted some color contrast between the black frame for our shaker box and our sentiments that are done with that black and white. So once I have this ink blended, I can set that aside for the background. This, because it's done with the large squiggly frame, is going to be bigger than the squiggly rectangles I have for the frame. And I chose that on purpose. I wanted the color to extend outside of that shadow box. I thought it would just look a little bit more interesting. If you wanted, you could use the same size of the squiggly frame that you use for the frame. But again, I just thought it was going to be a little bit more interesting and have that color extending out. So here we have it going a little bit farther out from our frames. And once I put our frame down, you'll see how much smaller this is. Then we have those 5 stacked ones that we're going to put onto our card base. Then we will add those floral die cut bits from the Bitty Floral stencil and die. So because that outer that ink blended background was the inner part of our large squiggly rectangle. You can see it's a completely different, like the squiggles go kind of opposite, but it has a really fun and unique look to it. You could take another black piece of cardstock and cut that frame with that black cardstock and have another black outer layer to it. I opted not to for this card, but that is another option. So once I've trimmed out the excess of that mirror or that window sheet on the front of my shadow box, I set that aside for a moment and we're ready to put those pieces on the inside of the shadow box. Now, because these are stenciled and die cut and there is that stickles on top of them, the stickles glitter gel, it's going to add that sparkle, but what it's also going to do is if we shake it too much, they're going to start to pile together. If you want to avoid that, you can do more layers of the squiggly frame. I left it as is because these particular die cuts are a little bit larger than, say, confetti bits that you would put into a shaker card. For behind where the sentiment is, they kind of stay in the same place. They don't really move. So we have some of those shaker bits or some of those bitty floral bits that are going to move in our shaker box and some that are kind of be stationary because they're a bit thicker with that glitter gel on them. Now, I only chose the florals and the larger leaves. There's some smaller leaves here that I could have put in there, but there's a lot of them and I didn't want to overfill that shaker box. So I opted to leave those out. But again, you could put those in if you wanted a little bit more. So I'll set those aside to the back. Now I also made sure that all of my floral bits were facing up. The color piece was facing up. Now when I go to put my window onto the front of my card, there is a little bit of static on that window sheet. To eliminate that, use a little bit of embossing tool before adding the glue. But what happened was one of those confetti bits or the die cut bits flipped over. So we see a white one in there. That's totally fine. I could have lifted it up and changed it, but I didn't want to chance that more were going to do that. And I couldn't put that embossing powder tool on there because I already had my liquid glue on there. Now, because we have that shaker box behind there, I'm just going to do the simple sentiment on the front. So I have my friend die cut on there, adding one of the stamped and embossed sentiments, sub-sentiments right on top of that, gluing that with the liquid glue. Now with the liquid glue and the window sheet, we have to let it dry for just a little bit longer. So you can see when I shake this, some of those pieces move, but the pieces behind my sentiment don't really move, and I'm totally fine with that. If you want to recreate that card and you want them to have more movement and more space, just add a couple more squiggly frame die cuts to your shaker box. For this next card, I'm once again using the squiggly rectangle frames. Again, this is the second largest one. I am using this for one card. I'm going to be using the inner part. For another card, I'm going to be using just that frame, that outer part. So we're going to use this for two different cards. Use the largest of the squiggly rectangle frames to die cut some white cardstock. I am ink blending that with some Wilted Violet, and then I'm going to be using that Opal blush interference ink to add a little bit of color to that frame. I just love the color or the look of the distress and the interference blended together. It just has a little bit of an interesting look to it. And I wanted to coordinate with the flowers that were in there. So for this card, I'm using that outer frame. I'm going to glue this to the base of the card. And once I glue it down, you can get a better idea for how big this largest rectangle frame is. Now, the cool thing about the rectangle frame is it just does that frame. You could create a shaped card with the inner size or the inner die cut piece from there. So it would be a little bit smaller than A2 size if you wanted. Once I have that first frame added in there, I can glue down the second one. This is the floral frame that we just die cut. And then I'm going to put some black cardstock in the center for something just a little bit different. This is going to just show off our sentiments and our florals just a little bit differently than having them on white cardstock because they're going to be a little bit more contrast to them. So for this card, I'm using one of the stamped and embossed and die cut hello sentiments, as well as one of the sub sentiments with it. I'm going to glue those sentiments down first, and then we're going to start to add some florals behind it. Now, if you prefer, you could do the florals and then add your sentiment afterwards. I typically like doing the sentiments for this first because I know exactly where I want those to go. And I find it a little bit easier to just start tucking florals in afterwards to kind of fill in that open space. But again, there's not a right or wrong to this. Everyone has a different process. So if you prefer, you can easily put your florals where you want them to go and then choose where you want your sentiment and your sub sentiment to go. So I'm starting with some larger purple die cuts or florals. That way it coordinates with our outer frame, that is the purple and the opal blush, then adding a little bit of the pink and the orange to them as well. So once again, once I have all those florals exactly where I'm going to want them, I'm adding a little bit of stickles to the centers of the flowers as well as some of the stamen, just to add that little bit of extra texture as well as that bit of sparkle. We still have that shimmer from the interference inks on our stamped florals, but the stickles just give it a little bit of something different to catch the light. I always love finding different ways to add extra texture to things, so I will typically use stickles in the centers of florals for that reason. We're doing the next card here with that inner part of our squiggly rectangle frames die cut. I am framing this with a black die cut, so we have the contrast between the black and the floral. I also took the third largest squiggly frame and die cut another frame with black, because I thought it would look interesting to have a couple frames on here and have that black one on the inside on top of that floral stencil background. So because we have that floral stencil background, in my opinion, we don't need a whole lot. I didn't want to put extra florals on top of there because we already have those florals in the background. You could, if you wanted, say, put some of the orange florals that we don't have on this background to add a little bit of contrast to it. But that background is just such a pretty one. I didn't want to cover it up. So I'm just adding a simple happy birthday friend sentiment on there. Such a simple card. The hardest part was stenciling those backgrounds and waiting for them to dry, but the actual card creation, because all of those pieces are ready to go, is so easy. For this last card here, I'm not even using the squiggly frames. I'm just using our sentiments as well as some of our leftover florals here. I put the hello down first, and then I'm going to be adding the sub-sentiment after doing the florals. The hello obviously has a lot more presence and it's a lot heavier than the sub-sentiment, so I'm going to be doing the sub-sentiment over top of the florals afterwards. Once again, I'm going to customize some of the greens by just cutting them a little bit. I will often do this with the different die cuts as well. I'll just take the ends off or cut a certain leaf off or whatnot. You can easily customize your stamps and your die cuts to what you want. If it's not exactly how you want it as is, there's no reason why you can't do this. Again, I have another one here where I took the base of the flowers. So these are stems that are intended to go onto these florals, and I just wanted the florals on their own because they were so large. I didn't really want the stems glued in certain areas. So by tucking those leaves behind there, we still get those leaves, but they have a different purpose. They have a little bit of a different look than the way the die set or the stamp set is intended to look. So once I have a bunch of these tucked in there, we can add that sub-sentiment over top. Now I glue them straight on there. You could, if you wanted, add some foam tape if you wanted to give it a little bit of extra dimension that way. That would look fabulous as well. With that sub-sentiment on there, I can add some of the tiny florals, just fill in some of the areas. I find that just filling in afterwards is what works best for me. I will often kind of have an idea where I want the big things to go. Then I will do some leaves and then I'll just kind of fill in different areas just because some of the areas just look like they're a little bit plain, and filling it in just fills that out a little bit. Then once again, that last step is putting those stickles on there and letting it dry. Because we're only putting dots, I want to say like 15 minutes is probably a good amount of time for that drying time. Another thing that you can do is take a scrap piece of paper and just put a dot or two of stickles that is similar to the size on your project. That way, if you want to test to see if something's dry, you can always touch that scrap and you don't have to chance ruining your actual project. I have everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. So if you're curious about something, you'll find the information for that there. Here are those finished cards, and I absolutely love the combination of those gorgeous bright florals, that little bit of shimmer that they have because of the interference inks, the sparkle with that stickles in the centers of the florals, but contrasting with the blacks on the frames as well as the sentiments, and having that contrast between the color and the black and white. I think it makes it really effective. I love the different florals in here. There's some unique ones, especially with the abstract florals, something that you don't normally see. And having that combination of flower sizes really makes it interesting and fun to create with. These would be fabulous, those abstract florals, for scrapbook pages or mixed media projects as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.